banks building. While Washington stalls on a bill, that's the two-word reality already running in production. BlackRock passed on filing a spot XRP ETF. We covered that decision already. This isn't that video. Here's the part that story missed. BlackRock declining a retail product has nothing to do with whether banks are building institutional infrastructure. Those are two separate tracks, and only one of them is actually stalled. In plain terms, one asset manager's ETF decision tells you nothing about what the banking system underneath it is doing. Let's look at the track that isn't stalled. 6 asset managers already run live spot XRP ETFs. Franklin Templeton, Canary Capital, Bitwise, Grayscale, 21 Shares, and RX Osprey, holding roughly $1 billion combined. Here's the number most coverage skipped. Canary Capital's own CEO put a specific figure on what it would take for BlackRock to enter roughly $3 billion in XRP ETF assets under management, about 3 times where the category sits today. That's not speculation. That's the actual commercial threshold one competing firm's leadership stated publicly. Put simply, BlackRock isn't blocking anything. It's waiting for a number the same way it waited before launching its Bitcoin product. Now, here's why that number doesn't matter nearly as much as the headlines suggest. Think of an ETF as a retail-facing wrapper, a packaged product built so ordinary brokerage accounts can hold exposure without touching a wallet directly. CaaS, or crypto as a service, is a completely different layer. It's the infrastructure banks use internally, custody, settlement, compliance tooling, delivered through an API from a specialized provider instead of built in-house. A bank does not need to wait on any single ETF issuer's threshold to deploy CaaS. The two systems don't depend on each other at all. Strip away the institutional language, and here's what's actually happening. One is a product decision measured in billions of dollars of demand. The other is a plumbing decision measured in a vendor contract and a compliance sign-off. In plain terms, the ETF story and the infrastructure story got tangled together in coverage, and they were never actually the same story. Here's what CaaS actually touches once a bank signs that vendor contract, because the surface level explanation undersells it. Think of correspondent banking as the current system where one bank routes a cross-border payment through a chain of intermediary banks, each one taking a cut and adding a delay before the money reaches its destination. CaaS providers plug banks directly into distributed ledger settlement corridors, collapsing that intermediary chain into a single near-instant transaction leg. That means the underwriting engine tracking a bank's transaction velocity, how fast money actually clears, is watching a completely different risk profile than it was 2 years ago. Here's what that actually means for you. A payment that used to take 2 to 5 business days through correspondent banks can settle in the corridor in seconds, and the compliance tooling monitoring it updates in real time instead of overnight. That's not a guess. That's the operational difference vendors selling this infrastructure are pricing directly into their contracts with banks. Look at the numbers on adoption speed here, because this is where the real momentum sits. Providers running this infrastructure report cutting bank deployment timelines from 12 to 18 months down to weeks at a fraction of custom build costs. In plain terms, banks aren't just adding a crypto feature, they're quietly replacing a slower settlement chain with a faster one underneath products customers never see by name. Now let's talk about the compliance side, because this is the part that actually explains why banks move carefully even when the technology is ready. Think of Basel III as the rulebook that decides how much safety reserve a bank must hold against every asset it touches. The riskier the classification, the more capital gets locked up and unusable for anything else. Under Basel's current treatment of unclassified digital assets, banks must hold as much as $12.50 in reserve for every single dollar of exposure, which is why banks favor vendor-delivered compliance tooling that's pre-built to satisfy that exact reserve math. That's not a Clarity Act problem, and it's not a BlackRock problem either. It's a capital rulebook that exists independent of both. Here's the part that's going to matter more over the next 6 months than any single ETF filing. In the next section, I'm going to show you the actual customer banks are building this infrastructure for and it isn't who most coverage assumes. While ETF issuers compete over retail brokerage dollars, the banks running CaaS are competing over a completely different customer show corporate treasury departments and payment processors who never touch a brokerage account at all. That's not a guess. That's the customer base CaaS providers explicitly build their compliance tooling around because treasury departments move volume that dwarfs retail ETF inflows on a single settlement day. Put simply, the audience investing in XRP through an ETF and the audience banks are actually building infrastructure for are two different groups with two different reasons to care, moving on two different timelines. There's one more piece of plumbing worth naming here because it explains why this infrastructure shift was already locked in before any Clarity Act debate started. Think of ISO 20022 as the shared messaging language banks use to describe a payment to each other: sender, receiver, amount, purpose. Standardized so systems across different countries can read the same transaction the same way. The global banking network, including SWIFT, has been migrating onto this exact messaging standard, and it's built to carry richer transaction data than the older formats it replaces. Here's what that actually means for you. Settlement networks designed around real-time, data-rich messaging, the same category CaaS providers build on, are a more natural fit for that migration than the correspondent banking chain it's replacing. That's not a guess. That's an infrastructure decision multiple central banks and the SWIFT network itself already committed to, independent of any single country's crypto legislation. Now let's talk about where price forecasts fit into this because there's a pattern worth flagging. Standard Chartered revised its 2026 XRP price target down to $2.80 after originally projecting as high as $8, citing ETF outflows and broader macro headwinds. And in the same call, raised its 2030 target to $28. Here's the part that's easy to miss in a headline built around the downward revision. A bank cutting a near-term number while raising its long-term number isn't reversing its thesis, it's separating short-term flow volatility from long-term infrastructure conviction. In plain terms, that's the same split this entire video has been describing. Short-term product demand is choppy and headline-driven. Long-term infrastructure adoption is quiet and largely indifferent to this month's price action. So here's the actual takeaway, stripped of the noise. BlackRock's ETF decision is a demand threshold, not a blockade, and it's not this channel's story to retell. The real infrastructure story is banks deploying CaaS on a completely separate track, serving a completely different customer, unaffected by any single asset manager's timeline or any pending vote in the Senate. While Washington stalls, banks are already building, and now you know exactly which track to watch and which customer they're actually building it for. In plain terms, stop reading ETF headlines for infrastructure signals. They're two different systems, serving two different customers, moving on two different clocks, and only one of them is actually waiting on anything.